have a wonderful show for you people if you want to hear it. Or maybe it'll be bloody awful. Who knows what kind of a day I'm having. But I don't know. I was asked to come and do my thing, which is usually playing a bunch of songs in kind of a folky punk rock style and telling a couple stories. This weekend, as you guys all know, is May Day weekend, right? May Day has a long and interesting, complicated, and varied history. If anyone knows much about the old traditions of Beltane from the Irish tradition, it's an old pagan festival that celebrates. It's a fertility festival that was, basically celebrated the union of the solar god with the earth goddess, and they would get together and just like erect this giant maypole and do some funny dances around it. Well, then they would go out and fertilize the fields and make merry with the lads and lasses. As times changed, though, over generations, over the course of several thousand years, with the introduction of Christianity and the changes in different forms of economic and religious and political control, the relationship of the poor and their connection to the land and the culture and traditions of their ancestors, well, that stayed the same to a degree, but the relationship between the overlords changed throughout the years. And you can see over the course of 1,000 years, beginning with the introductions of Christianity up through, the Protestant Reformation and then the beginnings of capitalism, that people's connection to their land and their ability to be intimately involved in control of their lives, to be intimately connected with the resources and their connection to the land, that was slowly taken away. First, back in the old days, even during the pagan kingdom eras, everyone got to work on the land. The land was common everywhere, and you just kind of like grew things for your own good, and you shared it with each other. You took care of the poor and the orphans and the widows and the lunatics. But over the course of several centuries, you saw land being taken away, and it got smaller and smaller and smaller until eventually, subsistence farming was the best that people had, and that led to, in Ireland, the commons, the common land was gone, and now they've got just these little patches, and they're like, well, let's just grow these potatoes, this new thing that came from Argentina, and we could live off them, so they were eating nothing but potatoes, until the blight came, and then 1/3 of Ireland's population starved, another third came here, another third stayed behind. But the point being is that over the course of history, though, the mechanisms of control of political, economic, and religious institutions, they changed over the years, but the struggle has really always been the same, which is to live a life of dignity and to honor, and to be able to have some level of control over your life, whether it was the olden days up to the industrial workers of the world in the early 20th century who were working to basically seize the methods of production by controlling all the factories, and then you can even look further, like today down in Chiapas, the Zapatistas are struggling to maintain their lifestyle and to the culture and traditions and the land of their ancestors. So in England, in the 1640s, there was this really super interesting group that started up, and they called themselves the Levelers, but we know them better as the Diggers. Does anyone know who the Diggers were? So I like to tell little bits and stories of interesting radical, groups throughout history that people maybe haven't heard of, because they were very influential and led up to a lot of the resistance movements that we have today. So the Diggers were, and this is like in the 1640s in England. They were, the landlords had taken away everyone's land, right? And so the public commons weren't there anymore, and there was a slow progression towards putting people off their land so that the royalty and the nobility in England could hire people to use it for cattle grazing so that they could have beef to feed people in England, right? And so these Diggers, they're Christians, and they had found this passage in the Bible that talked about the levelers who leveled the playing field and basically took land back. So they were kind of like a back to the land nature group. Not to be confused with the Ranters, who also happened at that same time, but they were all into free love and nudity, believe it or not, in the 1640s. So this group called the Diggers, what they did was they just tore down all the fences where they weren't allowed to grow their food anymore. They just ripped all that up and said, screw that. All land in common, all beings one. They took over the land and they started growing their own food. As you can imagine, the landlords, and they were all mad about all that. And they called in Oliver Cromwell, who was this horrendous Puritan crusader from England that devastated Ireland. But he came down and basically destroyed the Diggers. But their spirit lives on. And so this is a song called "The World Turned Upside Down" by a fellow by the name of Leon Rosselson, who wrote it. It's about the Diggers. 1649 to St. George's Hill. Ragged men they called the Diggers came to show the people's will. They defied the landlords, they defied the laws. Were they dispossessed, reclaiming what was theirs. We come in peace, they said to dig and sow. Come to where the land and come and make the wastelands grow. This earth divided, we will make whole. It will be a common treasury for all. The sin of property we do disdain. One's got any right to sell the earth for private gain. By theft and murder, they stole the land. Everywhere the walls rise up at their command. They make the laws to serve them well. The clergy dazzles us with heaven and damns us into hell. We will not worship the gods they serve. God who feeds the rich while poor folks starve. We come in peace, they said to dig and sow. Come to the land and come and make the wastelands grow. This earth divided, we will make whole. It will be a common treasury for all. We work, we eat together, we need no swords. We will not bow down to the masses or pay rent to the lords. We are free people, though we are poor. Diggers all stand up, for freedom stand up now. From the men of property, the orders came. They sent their iron troopers to wipe out the diggers' claims. Tore down their cottages, destroyed their corn. They were dispersed, but so the vision lingers on. We come in peace, they said to dig and sow. Come to where the land and come and make the wastelands grow. This earth divided, we will make whole. There will be a common treasury for all. Yeah, I forgot the words. You poor take courage, you rich take care. Earth was made a common treasury for everyone to share. All things in common, all beings one. They came in peace, the altars came to cut them down. So the Diggers, that was in England, they were pacifists. Now in Ireland, the story was a little different. Not much in terms of pacifism. Sometime a little bit later, during the late 1700s in Ireland, this very interesting pattern of resistance started happening amongst the Irish Catholics that were having their land stolen away. Once again, for the same reasons, to set up enclosements for cattle to graze to feed the rich people in England. So what you started seeing now was small bands of ragged, poor country boys dressing up in drag and going out at night and fighting against the landlords by tearing down the enclosures and plowing up the graze lands and just doing all things very, very similar to that. And in Wales, around the same time, there was this organization called Rebecca and Her Daughters, which was a bunch of they were peasant farmers that were mad that not only were they being ripped off and living this life of utter poverty, but in order to sell their their produce, they had to pay these tolls on the road they couldn't even afford that. And so they would dress up in women's clothes and blacken their faces or something like that, or wear masks. And they would do this little funny skit when they came to the toll gate, where the leader of the band, Rebecca, the other were Rebecca's daughters, and Rebecca would say, "Oh my dearies, what is this in front of me?" As though she's like an old blind lady. And then everyone would repeat in unison, "Why, Grandma Rebecca, we think it's a toll gate. What's this toll gate doing in front of me? Why, it's blocking your path and your freedom. Oh, what should we do about it? Do you want us to tear it down? Oh, that would be good." And then they would just tear it down and then go about their way. Back to Ireland, there was a group that emerged in the 1800s called the Molly Maguires, who once again would wear women's clothing and go out and destroy these fences and all the equipment that was being used. And they would send these. They were very much like the Earth Liberation Front of modern days, because they would send these communiques, but they would have them addressed from the ferries, which is very big in the pagan Irish history. So they were kind of revisiting some of their old traditions that had been lost to them and had been forgotten, but trying to bring things back. And they called themselves the Children of Save, who was an Irish fairy goddess queen who turned into a deer, and she was the mother of Oisin back in the pagan era, who was this great bardic poet warrior that today carries a lot of resonance. And he ran with this group called the Fianna, that's part of this mythological era of Irish storytelling, and that basically means wild animals. And they were kind of like the defenders of the people in Ireland. And so for the next 300 years, until Ireland finally gained their independence, the English referred to them as unrepentant Fenian bastards, because they saw them as like savages and unsophisticated. So anyway, after the potato famine, a bunch of these Irish came to the United States, and a bunch of them ended up in Pennsylvania, where there were some coal mines. And so the Molly Maguires actually came over and reformed the Molly Maguires here, because they didn't really have labor unions that would organize Catholic Irish, right? So they just kind of did it their old way, which was agrarian, violent, basically gangs. You can see that has anyone ever seen the movie The Gangs of New York? No. That's kind of what I'm talking about. It was like these different little sects of people that would come and they would kind of fight against each other. But anyway, the Molly Maguires were coal miners, and they were being murdered and exploited terribly by the property owners. And so they fought back the Irish way, which was they assassinated a couple of the owners of the mines, and then that led to this really terrible repression against the Molly Maguires, and several of them were captured and executed regardless of whether they were innocent or not. So this is a song called The Sons of Molly, about the Molly Maguires in the Pennsylvania coal mines. Sons of Molly, So Lamali McGuire's, that whole incident happened in the 1870s, which kind of really precipitated the later coal miner struggles that you all are probably maybe more familiar with in the early 20th century. Mother Jones, the great labor organizer, you guys have all heard of Mother Jones, maybe? Well, Mother Jones was so inspired. That was like one of the defining moments for her that kind of inspired her to be involved in labor politics and to help organize coal miners in Appalachia later on down the road. One of the ways that Mother Jones contributed was by getting together with a bunch of other prominent communist, socialist, anarchist labor organizers in the early 20th century for a giant meeting to form a new organization for, by, and of the working people. And that was called the Industrial Workers of the World, who believed that they could infiltrate all the industries and eventually have a general strike and take over all the factories and basically reclaim the methods of production of resources for the common good and stop working for profits, but just work only a little bit for sustenance. Now the IWW, they were a great organization. There was one fella in particular that most people maybe have heard of named Joe Hill, who was a member of the IWW. He was a poor fella from Sweden. Most of his family had been wiped out by polio at a young age, and he had been working since the age of 8. One day he got it up his butt that he was going to come to America, because it was always like this thing that, everything's better in America, for all these immigrants, when it really wasn't. So he came over to the States and bopped around, traveled around. He did some coal mining and worked in timber and did some fruit picking. And finally, he's just like, this is really stupid. We don't make any money. We're being treated like hell. We can't get, it's just horrible here. So he joined the IWW. Now, his major talent was that he was a songwriter and a wonderful musician. And so he started writing all these different songs for the IWW and helped to turn them into, rather than being taken over by kind of like mainstream socialist party organizations to just be a platform for their politics, he kind of helped to take it back and put it into the hands of the hobos and the anarchists and the actual working people on the streets. And he would just write all these parodies and set them to the tune of really prominent music that everyone knew, like religious music and stuff. And he just kind of believed, and he would just go everywhere, and he was just like this. He'd show up, and he would just be like this, like a solar deity or something like that. He'd just show up playing his guitar, and everyone would be like, Joe Hill's here, and he just would infuse all this spirit into any protest that he went to. So this is a song by Joe Hill, and I think I don't think that he meant it this way, but I think it kind of, in a way, is sort of like his life story. It's called Tramp. And it kind of speaks to the exclusion that poor working people might have felt back in the early 20th century, when you really had no laws or rules on your side. Bosses could work you to death. They could, if you didn't have a place to stay, you usually stayed at, their mining camps or something like that, and they charged you so much rent and they charged you so much money for food that after you got your paycheck, you would owe them $10 or something like that. So this is kind of speaks to the plight of the traveling hobo. By Joe Hill, Tramp. You all had shut your traps. I would tell you about a chap who's broken up against things, to be fair. He's not the kind of shark who's looking hard for honest work, but he heard that same old story everywhere. Tramp, 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 keep on tramping. Ain't nothing good here for you. But catch you around again, gonna make you wear that ball and chain. Keep on tramping, tramp, best thing you can do. Went up and down the street until the shoes fell off his feet. Saw the house by the lady cooking sign you read was what Jesus had said. Said here's my chance, I'll surely try. Kneel down on the floor until his knees got rather sore. Around suppertime, we heard that preacher cry. Tramp, 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 keep on tramping. Nothing doing here for you. Bet you're out again, gonna make you wear that ball and chain. Keep on tramping, tramp, the best thing you can do. Down the street he met a cop, and the copper made him stop. Said, boy, when did you roll into town? And whip me up to see the judge. But the judge, he said, oh fudge, bums that got no money needn't come around. He just said, tramp, 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 keep on tramping. Ain't nothing doing here for you. Catch your hand again, gonna make you wear that ball and chain. Keep on tramping, tramp, best thing you can do. So finally came that happy day when his life did pass away. He was sure he'd go to heaven when he died. He reached the pearly gates, old St. Peter full of hate, slammed the door in his face and loudly cried. Tramp, 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 keep on tramping. Ain't nothing doing here for you. Catch your hand again, gonna make you wear that ball and chain. Keep on tramping, tramp, the best thing you can do. In despair, he went to hell, the devil for the 12. But in truth, he had no other place to go. He said, I'm full of sin, so for Christ's sake, let me in. The devil said, beat it, you old hobo. Tramp, 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 keep on tramping. Ain't nothing doing here for you. Catch your hand again, gonna make you wear that ball and chain. Keep on tramping, tramp. It's the best thing you could do. Well, finally did come that happy day. So old Joe Hill got himself into a mess of trouble down in Utah. Has anyone gotten themselves into trouble in Utah? I have. Not as bad as Joe Hill. Joe Hill got kind of set up and framed on a murder charge. The copper bosses really wanted Joe Hill dead. So despite all the evidence to his innocence, despite pleas from, of all people, President Wilson and the daughter of the head of the Mormon Church of Utah, amongst Helen Keller, all these prominent people, and all these protests going on, Joe Hill was sentenced to die by firing squad. So he wrote a bunch of songs, sent them off, wrote Rebel Girl for Elizabeth Gurley Flynn to try to get more women involved in the IWW. And then he also wrote his last will and a letter to Bill Haywood. And I turned that into a song, because I think it's a really beautiful last will. It kind of resonates with an old paganish kind of cycle of life sort of thing. My will is easy to decide. belong to only you, Joe Hill. Goodbye, Bill. I die like a true rebel. Don't waste time mourning. Organize. Say it's 100 miles from there to Utah, Bill. Could you arrange to get my body hauled to the state line to be married? I don't want to be caught dead in Utah. And he was. Joe Hill was murdered. Joe Hill was murdered by the capitalist class on November 19, 1915. Supposedly, he's the guy that said, "Fire!" That's the story. No, but Joe Hill's story wasn't over yet. He became even huger. Huger, is that a word? Can I say that? He was huger. Oh, I'm from Jersey, I can do that.
Say
Huger.
what you want. It's cool.
But Joe Hill got even huger after his death and became kind of like this demigod of labor organizing. Everyone knew Joe Hill and invoked him all the way up until the 80s, and then just kind of Reagan happened and everything. So Joe Hill had a huge funeral in Chicago. 30,000 people attended. Imagine all these home bums and hobos and anarchists just descending on the streets of Chicago to say goodbye to Joe Hill. And so here's the beautiful part, though. Joe Hill was cremated, and they took his ashes, and they put him in all these little envelopes with his will printed on one side and a picture of him on the other side, and it said, "Joe Hill murdered by the capitalist class." And they mailed those packets out to every single IWW chapter in the United States, except for Utah. And all over the world, everyone got a packet of Joe Hill's ashes. And his wish, and what they did was on May Day, 1916, all over the world, IWW members took that packet of Joe Hill's ashes and released them to the wind so that he could go be part of the earth again and help some flowers grow. And Joe Hill's legend just kind of grew and grew and grew after that. And the funny thing is, there's a couple stories about random packets that either got seized by the feds during the Palmer raids and then got returned to the IWW, like in the late 70s and the early 80s. Utah Phillips, everyone know him? Yeah. He's a modern day wobbly hobo. He actually has a little bit of Joe Hill's ashes taped into his guitar. But the best story was, everyone know Billy Bragg? He's kind of an 80s folk funk radical singer. So I think a couple of the older guard had decided how good of an idea would it be if Joe Hill's ashes got eaten by today's modern radical folk singers. And so they gave some of the ashes to Billy Bragg and Michelle Schacht, who was actually quite radical at the time, and she didn't. So he ate his, so that when he dies, he'll get cremated, and then, some radical folk singers of that era, whenever he dies, can eat his ashes, and Joe Hill can live forever. But Michelle Schacht turned Christian, and which doesn't necessarily mean she was bad, but she didn't eat the ashes, and so Billy Bragg snuck into her house and stole the ashes and gave them to some IWWs. In the 1930s, a friend of Joe Hill named Alfred Hayes wrote a touching poem that kind of invokes Joe Hill's spirit, and then later on, down the road, another 10 years, Earl Robinson threw some music onto it, which doesn't matter because then it got changed by Joan Baez, and then it got changed again by Bruce Springsteen and Billy Bragg and all these people, and so it got changed again by me, but kind of close to the original. This is called Joe Hill. Dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, live as you and me. Says I, but Joe, you're 10 years dead. Never died, says he. Never died, says he. Salt Lake Joe, said I to him, smiling by my bed. They framed you on the murder charge. Says Joe, I am dead. Says Copper bud says, killed you, Joe. Shot you, and Joe said, I. Takes more than guns to kill a man. Says Joe, I never died. Says Joe, I never died. Standing there as big as life, smiling with his eyes. Joe said what they forgot to kill, and on to organize, and on to organize. Joe Hill ain't dead, he says to me. Joe Hill ain't never died. When working folk are out on strike, Joe Hill is by their side. Joe Hill is by their side. From San Diego up to Maine, and every mine and mill, when workers strike and organize, that's where you'll find Joe Hill. That's where you'll find Joe Hill. All right. And there you have it. That was my shoe for you guys. Very blessed Beltane and a merry Mayday.